Hello, welcome back. Are you all there? Okay, so this is the start of part 2 of our lectures about the Renaissance. Sorry that the first one was almost 13 minutes, but this one should be shorter. And I think there'll probably be 4 parts to this total. So like I said, with each of these lectures, or most of them, we return to this one image to give us kind of a sense of that moment, that transition from the early Renaissance to the High Renaissance, and this kind of period between, the 1430s to the 1440s is as good a place as any to really think about that. And so let's move on. So when we're talking about the transition, we looked at some images of the kind of proto-Renaissance, and in a way the Giotto piece is also from that same time period, early in the 1300s. But Giotto, as opposed to the Duccio and the Cimabue that we saw earlier, Giotto very much feels like he is talking about what's going to be coming in the Renaissance. He is doing images of scenes, narrative images of scenes rather than of just, he is also doing, images like this, Madonna and Christ enthroned type images, which are more symbolic spaces rather than spaces that are there for narrative reasons. But these are more like scene sets, like a stage piece, and the figures are characters, and they are rendered more like characters, more like they were based off of looking at real people. And we can definitely see that what Giotto did. Let me also say that Giotto is one of my favorite artists of all time. But what Giotto did was highly influential on that transition from the early Renaissance into the High Renaissance. So the Fra Angelico is still technically part of the early Renaissance because it's pre 1475, whereas the Botticelli is definitely part of the late Renaissance because it's after 1475. And at the same time, hold on a second, at the same time, once again, just want to make sure that we're keeping in mind, thinking about this. So Masaccio is also making that transition, and Masaccio is very much influenced by Giotto, and you can see that he's taking what Giotto was doing. Instead of making it like a stage set, he's trying to make it a little bit more like a real world space. It's still kind of a relatively flat space, but there is, it's a deeper space. And he's thinking about the point of view of the viewer when they're looking at this work of art, right? That this barrel vault, you can tell he was kind of thinking about the architecture of his time. This barrel vault, right, is very is at an angle specific to where our eye level would be, which is right about here. At the same time, in the Northern Renaissance, we were also seeing kind of a transition to a High Renaissance, but it's different. We don't have the time to talk about all the artists in the Northern Renaissance. We're just going to talk about one to represent this whole period. But it is one amazing artist, which is Albrecht Durer. And we'll be returning to Durer later when we talk about printmaking, because he was one of the most important printmakers ever, and very important in the development of printmaking in Northern Europe. This is a self-portrait by Durer right here. But he was also a very important artist as a painter as well, and especially this last painting that he made, The Four Apostles, is highly influential and shows a very different kind of approach to painting and to realism compared to what we were seeing in Italy. So that leads us back to Italy, to the High Renaissance in Italy. And so these artists, let's just go back a second. So now we're talking about artists like Piero della Francesca, as well as Uccello and Mantegna. These artists are definitely coming out of the tradition of Masaccio. And Masaccio is definitely coming out of the tradition of Frangelico and of Giotto. But these artists are trying to push it further. Piero della Francesca is also one of my favorites, one of the great artists of all time, definitely one of the great Renaissance artists. And there's just something so beautiful about both the solidity, the solemn simpleness of the way he paints and organizes things, and yet at the same time the absolute believability of it. Um, Other artists like Uccello and Mantegna, who are here down at the bottom, are there to represent a different side of this period of the High Renaissance, which is that experimental side, that stretching, trying to figure things out. In this case, both Uccello and Mantegna are trying to figure out something about perspective. They're trying to figure out, in Uccello's case, he's trying to figure out how to describe something as complicated and as chaotic as a battle scene, still using the rules of perspective. So you see how the weapons on the ground are following a perspective system. And Montaigne, on the other hand, was trying to figure out how to deal with extreme foreshortening on the human figure. And this is also a perspective problem, but it's also a pictorial problem and an issue of how to do this when you're also making an image of Christ, of Jesus, how to do it in a way that's faithful and respectful. So in the end, he actually diminished the perspective distortion in order to make us get a little bit more, a better, clear view of the head. The head's tipped up, but the head is also larger than it should be, just so that the image can reveal Christ the way he knows his audience would want it to be revealed. So one last thing I want to say about the High Renaissance before we get to some of the most famous artists of the Renaissance is that this period right before the really famous, the big four or big three, right before Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, this period is full of, there's so many great artists. And earlier in the first lecture we talked about that issue of, was the Renaissance really that great? Was it as important as sometimes the history books and the art history books sell it to us? And in some ways maybe it isn't as such a monumental shift and a change as sometimes as we are told it is, but in other ways it's really an amazing thing. And I guess one of the arguments for why it's such an amazing thing is just the volume of art and all the different artists here in this period, just the period of like the 1450s to the 1500. There were so many different artists all making fantastic art that you could have an entire art course just about that period. Okay, that ends part 2, and I will get back to you with part 3.